Hi there. This site is mostly dedicated to videos about psychology, but with a few dedicated to travel. And today I'd like to take you on a visit to Banff, Alberta, Canada, in the Rocky Mountains. Our visit here is in summer, but I've tossed in a few pictures from winter as well to give you a sense of how it changes. I know that people have stereotypes about Canada and snow, so don't be fooled. If you see snow in a photo, that's from December. Here, for example, is a picture taken from above in early winter. The border between Alberta and British Columbia is the Continental Divide, with water to the west flowing to the Pacific and to the east flowing to the Atlantic. There are parks in both provinces. Banff is the quintessential Canadian Rockies resort established as a federal reserve in 1885 when the hot springs were discovered at Sulphur Mountain, and as Canada's first national park in 1887. Today, the spine of the Rockies is occupied by a series of provincial and national parks, including Jasper, Yoho, Kootenay, and Waterton Lakes National Parks, and Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, to name just one. But Banff was the first, and most international visitors spend at least some of their time in Banff National Park or visiting the town of Banff. Here's a map of the immediate region showing Banff town site inside the park and some of the other parks in that chain. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Banff is quite central to the formation of Canada. A condition of British Columbia joining Confederation and not joining the United States instead was that the country build a railway across the country. And when they did that, they actually needed some reason for people to ride the railway. And so the railway built huge railway hotels all the way across the country, and specifically in the country's first national park, Banff. And this photograph shows you the Banff Springs Hotel, one of the more famous hotels in all of Canada. Still there, still a great place and well worth a visit. The town site of Banff actually grew up really around this original hotel. And it's quite large now. It's on the opposite side of the river from the hotel. Now, the town site, as you probably can imagine, is a little bit of a tourist theme town, and it's packed in the summer. But it does have some attractions of its own, and including, surprisingly, some reasonably priced restaurants. It's also the site of the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. This is a fairly old institution, but it's grown and grown and grown over the years to the point that if you get out of the town site and go up the hill to the site of the Banff Centre, you'll see that it's about the size of a small university. And it's really well worth a visit. If you find yourself wandering around the Banff town site, head on up to the Banff Centre. Take a look around. There may also be events taking place in one of their many theaters, and you can take a look and possibly get tickets for it. I did a writer's retreat at the Banff Centre recently, and this was the view outside my window. So here's the Rimrock Hotel, perched up on the side of the mountain above the Banff Springs, which is down there to the left, and beyond it, the town site itself. And this is the Bow River, which races past the Banff Springs. But just below it, you can do whitewater rafting. That's actually quite tame. They don't take you down this. Nobody would survive it. Okay, so what else would you do? Well, just outside Banff and just outside the national park is the town of Canmore, which has reasonably priced accommodations and is quite a nice town in itself, kind of reminiscent of Whistler, if you've ever been there, or indeed Aspen. Lots of great places to stay that aren't quite as expensive as inside the park. I have family in Canmore, and in June 2019, I wandered around the town's trails. Here they are. Canmore is an old coal mining area, and the remnants of that are all over the place. And even in this area, which doesn't look like it's right in the town, but actually it is, this walking trail and jogging trail, you will occasionally run into bears, as indeed I did on this day in early-ish June. In June, though, the bears apparently are not as much of a problem as the elk, which have just foaled and are quite protective of their young, so don't get near any elk either. Okay, so what are some trails that you could go on if you're a hiking aficionado? Well, one option that's pretty easy and doesn't involve a lot of elevation gain is the Hoodoo's Trail, which leads straight out of downtown Banff along the Bow River downstream from the Banff Springs Hotel, and it's quite scenic and takes you through some nice areas. Here's a sample. Ultimately, the trail takes you uphill a little, as you can see, and up to the Tunnel Mountain Campground, I believe it is. Now, the official destination of this trail is the Hoodoos, which essentially are just eroded piles of dirt. They are not nearly as impressive as the rest of the view, but it gives you something to aim for. And then going back, you can either go back along the road, you can take a side trip up Tunnel Mountain, which is not a particularly difficult hike, and or you can just go back the way you came, straight back into town. Rafting down the Bow is an option. This isn't really white-knuckle, death-defying rafting, as you can see, and it's something that families can engage in and so on. And that's bookable in advance. It departs from just below the Banff Springs. If you want real whitewater rafting, it's the Kicking Horse River. That's probably the one you want. Departures out of Yoho Park. Now, I've mentioned that Banff is kind of tourist central for the Canadian Rocky Mountain parks, and if you're going to arrive early or stay late, you may want to get out of town. Rent a car at the Calgary airport and use it to get out of Banff at some point. And there's a variety of places you can go. One is Lake Louise. In the Lake Louise area, there are a number of attractions. One of the most popular is Moraine Lake, although, frankly, I'm not entirely clear why. There is a trail that goes out to the back of the lake, which is quite nice, and it takes you closer up to those mountains that you see in the distance. But it's extremely busy. You have to get there very early in the morning. Otherwise, you're parking 5 kilometers away and getting bussed in. Actually, closer to 10 kilometers away, now that I think of it. And I think Moraine Lake is, personally, missable. You might think that you do want to see one of these turquoise lakes. You will, trust me. It's not just Lake Louise that's like that. All of the lakes are like that, or at least most of them in the Rockies. Now, along the short road from Lake Louise to Moraine Lake, there is a trail that's not very popular. Not that many use it. It's called the Lake Annette Trail, and I was on that in 2019. Quite liked it, and it's not overly challenging, but it takes you to, guess where? Lake Annette. And this is the lake, as advertised, yet another of these turquoise lakes. You can actually go swimming in the lake if you want to, and hike around the back of the lake and up a fairly steep patch, and you get out to this scree slope area where you have tremendous views of the mountains beyond. And you can stop here and turn around, or you can carry on. The trail goes for many kilometers beyond this. This is about where we stopped, though. So what about Lake Louise itself? Here's the lake and the Chateau Lake Louise, one of the railway hotels that I mentioned earlier, much expanded since its early days, and beyond it, the ski hill at Lake Louise. There's a trail that leads right along the lake. It's dead flat, totally easy, and really, I think, is one of the experiences that's worth having if you're going to the Rockies. Again, you have to arrive early to get the parking space near the chateau there. The parking area is just to the right in this photo. And just to the left, there's a trail that also leads up towards the Lake Agnes hut and towards the Planisix Glacier's hut. And you can do them both on the same trip. So here's the peak at the Lake Agnes hut with its tea house where you can have lunch or, of course, tea or whatever else you might like. It's pretty basic because everything has to be packed up the mountain. There's Lake Agnes itself, not turquoise for once. And here's the trail from Lake Agnes to join up with the trail to the Plain of Six Glaciers. And you can see that we're fairly high up above Lake Louise here. You go along this trail, which emerges out of the forest and into this glacier moraine area. And eventually you get to the Plain of Six Glaciers hut, where once again you can have coffee or tea or lunch or whatever. It is not outrageously priced, but do bring Canadian cash because they do not have the facility most of the time to take credit cards. Beyond the hut, you can take the lateral moraine trail up towards the toe of the glacier. And if you turn around, you can see that Lake Louise is way, way, way in the distance. So this is actually quite a long trail, but worth it and not too difficult for most people. Lots of kids up there. It looks like the glaciers have completely melted out and aren't there anymore, but in fact, where that dirt is off the trail, it is ice. It's just that the rock and so on has coated it. It's still glacier. Right up that area that looks like an avalanche trail, there is a hut right at the top. You are never going to go there unless you're a real mountaineer, but it is up there. Can't really see it in this video. But you can sit up here, eat a snack, and wait for bits of the glacier to fall off. Which, if you're lucky, it might. Lake Louise is also a great place in winter, as you can see. They zamboni part of the lake and open it up for skating. There's skiing on the other side of the valley and sledding just beside the hotel itself. So where else could you go? Well, if you drive up the main highway towards Jasper, eventually you'll get to the Columbia Icefields. It's a long ways, but the Icefield Parkway is one of the great drives on Earth. It's very much worth doing. Once you get there, you can see the toe of the glacier, and it's easy enough to walk out toward it. And you can see how the glacier has been receding for the last 100 years. They have posts for the different years where the toe actually was. And you can see that there are groups that actually go out hiking on this. These are guided groups. You have to book this. It's best to book this in advance to make sure you get on a trip. They don't want you going out onto the glacier because, of course, you will fall into a crevasse and never be seen again. They also have giant wheel buses that will actually drive out onto a part of the glacier. If hiking is not for you, that's another way to do it. Let's go back down the highway now toward Banff and take Highway 93 west, south of Lake Louise, into Kootenay National Park, which is so much of an also-ran in the Rocky Mountain Parks that it's not even named on this map. But that's what it is, Kootenay National Park. Not really a place where you probably want to spend a lot of time because most of it was burned in an enormous forest fire some years ago. Bits of it are coming back, but you probably want to see the other areas more. An accommodation option in the unburned area of the park would be Storm Mountain Lodge and Cabins, quite close to the highway with a bit of highway noise, but quite nice. These are essentially log cabins, and you can stay in them. They're not cheap, but there we go. Good restaurant. Just a few kilometers from there, and keep in mind this is only about an hour, if that, from Banff itself, maybe half an hour, is the Stanley Glacier hike. Well worth going on. It goes through New Forest, post-forest fire. You can see that these are not very tall trees. And it goes up into a glacier bowl. Now, my favorite of all the national parks in the Rocky Mountains is Yoho. Yoho is far off the beaten track as far as most tourists go. It can get crowded in places, but there are not nearly as many people as in the Banff area. It's a smaller park, somewhat fewer things to do, somewhat less variety, but it has some of the top attractions in the Rockies. I would really recommend going here if you've got a couple of days, or even if you just want a day's driving trip. The center of Yoho is the tiny little town of Field, which has, oddly, one of the best restaurants in the Rockies, Truffle Pigs. If you get a chance to go to Truffle Pigs, go there. It's a wonderful place, great food. They don't take reservations, however. Why not? Because they don't have to. It's going to be full. On the other side of the Trans-Canada Highway from Field, and just up a little road of its own, is Emerald Lake and the Emerald Lake Lodge, also a nice place to stay. You can come by and rent a canoe if you want, and canoe Emerald Lake. And do look at that mountain in the distance. Now, you may have heard of the Burgess Shale, immortalized in Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life. And you might have wondered, where exactly would that be? In somewhere in eastern Turkey or something? No, it's in Yoho National Park at the end of Emerald Lake. It's right up there. And you can pre-book a guided trip, if you're a geology fan, to get up into this area of fossils. Here's the Emerald Lake Lodge area itself. Reasonable restaurant, not as good as Truffle Pigs, I think. And just a couple of kilometers back on the road toward Banff, you can take another turn off up towards Takaka Falls. Now, if you're driving an RV, I'm not sure I would recommend this because it can be a little scary for people. There are some switchbacks on this road. If you're in a rental car, totally fine. You can absolutely do this. But if you're in a long RV, what they demand that you do is drive up one switchback, reverse up the next one, and then forward up the third. Most people don't like doing this, although they do it with Greyhound-style buses. So it's safe, apparently, but a bit unnerving. Takaka Falls is the third highest waterfall in Canada, and it's sort of a big tourist central area, but it's worth seeing. We're stopping off to look at. It's hard to get a sense of the scale, so here I've focused on a person, and you can get a sense of how big this thing actually is. All around the base of Takaka Falls, you'll find these pikas with their sharp, high-pitched calls. And that brings me to what I think is the best hiking trail in all of the Rockies, at least of the ones that I've been on, and that's the Ice Line. It starts just opposite the parking area for Takaka Falls and goes up and up and up. As you can see, there's the falls in the distance. And it takes you right up into glacier territory. It's a beautiful hike with wonderful views. And eventually it comes down into a greener area and then back along a trail back towards the Takaka Falls parking lot. So those are a couple of options for day trips out of Banff. But also places you might want to spend a couple of days. There's lots more. I haven't talked about Jasper much at all. I haven't talked about Waterton Lakes National Park. I haven't talked about the rest of British Columbia. And I haven't talked about Calgary. Anyway, lots to do in case you want to spend more time. Hope that's helpful.